inventory and basic collections. Okay, so remember back a couple of nuggets ago, we talked about the difference between discovery data and inventory data. And where discovery data is really kind of the small amount of data that you get by searching around on the network and looking for available resources that may be at the other end of an IP address. And inventory data is going to be that much more rich level of data that we get once we start adding clients onto systems in our configuration manager infrastructure. Well, now that we've applied the clients to our infrastructure, we can start talking about those clients and their pulling of inventory out of the client and into the site server. In the last nugget, we installed the client, and we'd worked with these inventory client agents, or really all the client agents, to say, okay, client, I want you to begin performing some actions for me. Well, we're going to make a return back to those client agents and take another second look at them to talk about the hardware and the software inventory and all the information that is being pulled back into our site server. We're going to take a look at that inventory also. We're going to view the inventory and sort of get a feeling for what kinds of data that our clients can actually pull to our site server. And we'll take that inventory and actually talk about how to create collections out of that inventory. There are some very specific customizations to inventory, also called MIF and MOF files, that we can use. If our standard installation of Configuration Manager doesn't pull the kinds of information we want out of our clients, we can actually customize and pull additional new information out of clients as well. And we'll talk about the use of MIF and MOF files to actually pull that data. Once we get the data and once we get the inventory information, obviously, we want to be able to use that inventory to create reports and to create collections and push patches and deploy software. And a lot of that is done through what we call collections. And we'll talk about what we're doing with collections and how to create collections and some of the predefined collections in this nugget. Specifically in this nugget, we're going to talk about those that come by default with Configuration Manager, and also the easy collections, the basic collections, what we call direct membership collections, and how you can create direct membership collections to put specific computers into collections. So we want to start actually by going back to these client agents. And what you'll find is that we'll be keeping returning back to these client agents from time to time so we can revisit the kind of information, the kind of configuration that our clients are pulling back into our site server. And in this case, we want to go back to the client agents to talk about the software and hardware inventory client agent. There's really not a lot here. I mean, we really talked about how you want to enable hardware inventory and enable software inventory. And we talked about how you may want to set your schedule to greater or fewer number of days depending on the resolution of the data that you want. But we also skipped over the last nugget, this other tab here called MIF collection, and also this custom MIF file size here, which is 250. I want to talk a little bit about these ID MIF and no ID MIF files. There are really two different kinds of MIF files, and these MIF files are used, they're kind of text-based files, and I'll show you what they look like here in a minute, but they're text-based files that are used to extend the amount of data that our clients are pulling into our server. First of all, we'll start with a no ID MIF file. A no ID MIF file is used to modify or append, essentially to augment an object class or properties to existing client inventory records. The idea here is I have an existing sort of class of information, and I want to add additional information into that class. I want to add additional stuff that I'm pulling off of the client out of an existing class. That's why we call them no ID, because there's no ID that I'm creating in order to run these MIFs, in order to augment my clients. I can also collect what we call ID MIFs. And if I don't have an existing class, if I don't have an existing architecture worth of information, then I can actually create that from scratch, which is why we call them ID MIFs. We have to create an ID for them. And the process to actually instruct the clients to begin collecting ID and no ID MIF files is done by selecting these two checkboxes. If I select these two checkboxes, all that instructs the client to do is say, okay, well, it's okay for me. If you send me an ID MIF or a no ID MIF, I will collect that and begin to collect the information you request inside of those ID MIF or no ID MIF files. And so it really hurts me, it doesn't hurt me at all by selecting these here, because all it's going to do is tell the client to watch for any ID MIFs or no ID MIF files that I may create. Now, the next question you're probably asking is, okay, well, what are these files? Let's go ahead and close this down, and I've actually put together a couple of sample ID MIF and no ID MIF files for us. Let's start with a no ID MIF, because likely, if you're going to be creating these, there's more of a chance you'll be creating a no ID MIF, more so than an ID MIF, because, again, No IDMF files are used to augment existing classes. So you'll see here, under system information, for example, I may want to create a new class called asset number. In this asset number class, for example, I want to collect the computer asset number attribute. And it's a type string, and there's a value for that string. So what I do is I create this no IDMF, then I actually deposit this no IDMF onto the client to instruct the client, okay, well, this is some information that I want to store. I want to place that file on each individual client in the C program files SMS CCM inventory folder. So let's actually go there. I'm going to click on Start here and click on Run here, and you'll see I'm going to C program files SMS_CCM inventory. And sub to that folder, this is the client. Now this is not the server. This is on the client. I have two subfolders for IDMIFs and no IDMIFs. And once I create that IDMIF or no IDMIF, I'm going to drop it in this location on each individual client. Now you're probably thinking, well, wait a minute, I got to go to each individual client and throw this file in a folder somewhere on each client to start this custom creation? Well, you think about it, SMS is a software distribution system, so it would be relatively easy for you to create a package to deploy this file to that location. So it's a little more trivial than what it seems. So once I create this IDMIF, I can drop it into the location here in the no IDMIFs folder, and the client will process it, reconfigure itself to begin pulling that information and sending that information back to the SMS site server. Again, IDMIFs and no IDMIFs are designed for two different things. This is a no IDMIF because we are only collecting additional information from an existing class. We have an IDMIF here which actually creates a different class, a different architecture of information. Here we're calling the architecture just widget. We're adding system information and we're calling it the widget group, and we're collecting a widget asset number of this string and this value. And so you can see here we're actually creating a brand new class or brand new architecture of data here using an IDMIF. So these are the two tools that you will use to actually update the client, to instruct the clients what kind of additional information do you want to collect. Let me go back here to the Configuration Manager console and back to the Hardware Inventory Agent here. And once we select these here, again to repeat, once we select these here, we have to create those files and then drop them onto each individual client. Same thing happens with the software inventory client. You'll see there aren't any IDMIFs or no IDMIFs here because those are generally used for collecting hardware-specific data. Really what we've talked about here in the previous nugget really encapsulate what you need to know in terms of software inventory for the software inventory client agent. Now all this talk of IDMIFs and no IDMIFs and hardware inventory and software inventory may have your head spinning, but we're not really done yet. Now, what I just explained in terms of IDMIFs and no IDMIFs can be somewhat challenging because the process to actually distribute IDMIFs and no IDMIFs can be somewhat challenging. And you've got to actually go to each client and add that information into the client. And for the most part, adding additional classes, brand new classes of data, or brand new data that you may not already be collected as part of the system's WMI store is something that may not necessarily be done very often. What may be the case is that your SMS infrastructure, your clients, are not pulling a piece of information that is already there, but they're not configured to pull that information and put it back in the existing database. Now, there's another way in which we can actually go and make these modifications as well. When we talk about MIFs and MOFs, the process of doing no IDMIFs and IDMIFs is actually one of the more complex ways of adding data into the database. There is two other files called the SMS-def-mof and the configuration.mof that can be used to change the types of data that we're pulling in. Now let's think about this for a second, right? Inside of our WMI store in our systems, inside of our database, we have lots and lots of different information. And in that information, we're only pulling certain amounts of it out for each client because we don't want to overload our database. And Microsoft has made a determination as to what sort of data they're going to pull by default, but the determination that they've made may not be what you need. Maybe you need more information about your network card than they haven't provided it, or maybe you want to learn more about your disks and they haven't provided it. You know that it's in there, and you don't necessarily need to create anything completely custom, but all you want to do is just check the checkbox, more or less, that tells the SMS client, okay, go ahead and start pulling this information because I want to be able to collect based off of it. In those cases, we're going to be using MOF files. These two MOF files, SMS-def-mof and configuration.mof. These two files are very, very large files that have all of the possible, or most of the possible things that we can collect on any particular client, and then we can just essentially flip the bit for each thing that we want to turn off or turn on each client. Let's actually take a look at these two files and show you how this is going to be just a little bit easier of a process for you to use. So what I want to do is minimize this and go back to our system here. And we're actually going to get out of the console because the process of doing this MOF change, this is a text-based change. We're going to go look at text files here. So I'm going to minimize this, and we're going to close these down because we don't need to see these anymore. And then what I want to do is go to Start and Run, and then back to my Configuration Manager location, which is under Program Files, Microsoft Configuration Manager. And if you remember, we talked about these inboxes, right? In these inboxes, in the clifiles.src, this is another inbox which contains the SMS def mof and the configuration.mof files. You'll see they are here. You'll notice how large these files are. SMS def mof is 152K in size. It's a pretty large file. I'm going to actually open it up and show you an example of what it looks like. The SMS def mof is relatively the same. This is the default one that we get whenever we install the system, and so every brand new instance of Configuration Manager is going to have the same SMS def mof. Now let me scroll down here just a little bit past some of the initial stuff so we can take a look at some of the examples that we can choose for data that we may want to pull in, for example. So let's find one here that's of interest to us. Maybe here's computer system, right? So this is an SMS group name called computer system. There's a class ID associated with it, and here is some properties of that class that we're actually taking a look at here. Now you'll see that for the computer system group name, we are allowing ourselves to generate reports on it. We are collecting this group. And then sub to this group, we have additional properties that we may or may not want to collect. In this case here, we see SMS report equal to true for current time zone. That says, okay, client, out of computer system, out of the WMI and the computer system area, I want you to actually collect current time zone information off of that client. I want you to collect the description information off of that client. I want you to collect domain information off of that client. But perhaps I'm not interested in collecting admin password status or automatic reset boot option or automatic reset capability. These are ones that are set to false. Now you'll see here as we sort of scroll down here, there are all kinds of trues and false in each one of these classes and each one of these properties that we could potentially collect if we want. Anything that is set to true is something that our clients will automatically collect. Anything that is set to false is something our clients are configured not to collect. Now, if you remember with the IDMIFs and no IDMIFs, I had to create them. I had to code them by hand and then throw them onto each one of my individual clients to get them to start collecting this information. Well, with the SMS def mof, it's much, much easier. Let's say I'm interested in collecting thermal state information from my clients. The process to tell my clients to begin collecting this is as easy as just changing this false to a true and then saving the file. I want to keep the file structure relatively the same here, so put the correct spacing in place. But all I really need to do is set those elements from false to true that I want my clients to push back to my site server and then save the file. Over a period of time, SMS looks at this file and looks for changes. And if the file has changed, if the SMS def mof file has changed, it will automatically ingest that into its site system. It will compile it. It will do what it needs to do. It will instruct the clients automatically that they need to be pulling this information and giving it back to the site server. And so you can see here how simple it is for me to extend the data that my SMS system is, my SMS infrastructure is collecting by simply changing these falses to trues. And I have all kinds of things in here. Computer system product information, I have desktop monitor information, I have device memory address information, Win32 disk drive information. All of these things are available to me. These are many of the classes, most of the classes and properties that are available in WMI. And if I see something that I need to collect, if I need to base some collection off of this information, I can go through and simply just change these falses to true. So, and again, just like we talked about before with this data, you have to be kind of careful with what you're going to set from false to true, because anytime you start collecting more data, that's going to be more information that has to get stored in your database and processed by your server. So think about the elements that you want to collect. I wouldn't necessarily recommend going through and clicking all of these and changing them from false to true, doing a find and replace on it, because the amount of data is just going to become enormous for each individual client that has to come into your system. I would suggest only actually collecting these if you're going to be creating collections based off of them, if you're going to be making use of the data in some way. Now the SMS def mof file, if I go ahead and close it and save it, that'll begin collecting that element that we just talked about before. SMS def mof has a lot to do with WMI. Configuration.mof has more to do with the registry information in there. If you want to look at specific registry keys that are being queried for their information, we can open up configuration.mof to change the types of registry keys and registry values that we may be collecting from our system. Here's configuration.mof, and you'll notice here that instead of looking at hives and classes inside of WMI. Instead here we're looking at keys, HKey local machine, software, Microsoft Windows, current version uninstall. And so for the uninstall key, we may be collecting this information. As we scroll down, you see that the data inside of configuration.mof looks relatively the same as what we see, or relatively different than what we're used to seeing in SMS-def-mof. So you can use configuration.mof in as much of a similar way as you can SMS-def-mof for collecting individual keys. Now the one thing you'll notice here is that what's different between the two is that you don't have the same sense of trues versus false in configuration.mof. The process to collect individual registry settings is going to be just a little bit more work because there's more coding to be done. So similar to an IDMIF and no IDMIF, using this MOF file is probably going to be a little bit challenging to you because you're going to have to figure out what the structure is for what you want to collect. But in the same vein as SMS-def-mof, all you need to do here is make the change. SMS will recognize, or configuration manager will recognize that the change has been made and automatically instruct the clients to begin collecting information based off of that. So these two files are going to be your friends whenever you want to change, or whenever you want to change what you are going to collect out of your configuration manager clients. All of this information goes back into the SMS database to populate the SMS database with that inventory information. So I brought up the console here again, and let's actually take a look at the data that we're actually pulling from a particular client. You'll see here under all systems I have my sccm Nugget client, which is also the server as well. And because it has a site code here, it actually has a client deployed to it, and we are pulling inventory information from that client. If I right-click on sccm Nugget and click under Start and Resource Explorer, I'll begin to take a look at what sorts of resources, both software and hardware, what sorts of inventory information is being pulled from that individual client. You'll see here that we're adding a snap into the console and we're bringing open Resource Explorer. I'm going to click the plus signs here and you'll begin to see, okay, under hardware, I can enumerate the different elements that are available in my SMS Configuration Manager database. I have Add Remove Programs information here. If I look at Add Remove Programs, here are all the programs that are currently listed in Add Remove Programs. Maybe I want to know information from my computer system. Here's the description of the computer system. It's AT-AT compatible. Here's the domain it's actually under. Here's the manufacturer. Here's the model. Here's the name of the system. Under Logical Disk, perhaps, maybe I want to know what sorts of logical disks are available. Here's a C drive and a D drive. Maybe I want to know what sort of motherboard's in there, what sort of information about that motherboard. I can also go down and see software information as well. I can say what sorts of collected files were collected from there, what sorts of file details. Maybe I want to know what sorts of products were available on that system. You'll see here under Files, I can look at all the files that were collected, the metadata about which was collected from the client. I can scroll down and say, well, let's see, here's a DLL file that was collected, here's a JPEG DLL file that was collected. This becomes handy for me for when I need to determine maybe if I want to update or patch a system. Well, maybe JPEG32.dll needs to be at a higher version number for it to be fully patched. Or maybe interop.msdsc.dll needs to be greater than 1 or it's not protected. These help me understand what the file level versions are of the software that's on my system. If I go back and look at software scans, I can see when my last software scan was, or maybe individual product details that are available for those products that are on my system. There's a concept called asset intelligence that actually takes the information that the client collects and converts it into useful things like knowing that Microsoft is on there, and sysinternals has things on there, and ThinPrint has software on there as well. And so all of this comes as part of the inventory information that we see on each client as we're pulling that information from the client. We're going to take this inventory information and we're going to use it to help us build collections and help us make actions or take actions based off of the inventory information that we've collected. Now let's stop here and think about this for a second. If I want to deploy a software update, and I know I have a software update, but it only works for particular laptops of a certain version. Now that I know which systems are laptops, now that I know which systems are maybe HP as opposed to Dell, now that I know which ones are at a certain version, I can create a collection based off of those parameters so I know I'm only going to be pushing this software to those specific instances, those specific machines on my network. This is the concept of a collection that we've been talking about so so far. Now, we want to talk just a little bit. If I go back to our list of things we want to discuss during this nugget, we talked about the two different kinds of collections. The inventory feeds into these collections, and in this nugget, we're going to talk about the basic collections, the first of which is the predefined ones, and the second of which are what we call direct membership collections. Let me show you again what these predefined collections are. You'll see these predefined collections here. These are the default collections, the native ones that arrive immediately when you install Configuration Manager. You'll see here we have all systems and all user groups and all users and the different types of systems that Windows 2000 or mobile or Server 2003 or XP. You'll see here that by looking at all of these systems, I can then drill down based off of the type of systems that are on my network. I know that certain systems are at certain levels. I know that I can do all desktops and all servers. I can just do the server systems as opposed to the client systems. This helps me populate or use this information to direct and target very specifically where I want software updates and where I want software packages and all this stuff to get deployed to whenever I get ready to actually make actions and make changes on the computer systems in my environment. Now let's actually take what we know here and create our first collection, our very first collection of systems. And the first types of collections we're going to create are actually these direct membership collections. And we call them direct membership collections because as opposed to basing the collection off of characteristics, instead we're actually going to base the collection off of just picking out computers out of my list of available computers, right? These are the basic collections. In the next nugget, we're going to start showing you how to create collections based off of characteristics, off of system characteristics of those systems that are currently being collected against. So I'm going to create a name and I'm going to call it Configuration Manager Servers. And I'm going to say this is a direct collection because I'm creating this as a direct collection here. So I click Next. And you'll see here we have two buttons. Under Membership Rules, this is the location where we're actually going to create rules that define which systems will be in this collection. Now I can choose one of these two buttons, the first of which is the Direct Membership Rule, and the second of which is the Query-Based Membership Rule. In the next nugget, we'll talk about this Query-Based Membership. I'm going to click this button to create a direct membership. I get a new wizard here for Create Direct Membership Rule. I'm going to click Next here, and then now we can choose what types of resources we want to collect in as part of this collection. You'll see that we can choose a resource class here. Is it going to be a system, a group, or a user? In our case, it's going to be a system. What sort of attribute name is interesting to us? In this case, I want to choose the computer name. The computer name is going to be, here under Name, the computer name is going to be the element that is of interest to me. And then lastly, I may want to choose a value. In this value, I want to say sccm nugget because I want to collect based on when the name is sccm nugget. Our next screen here allows me to limit the scope of where I'm going to search for this resource. You'll see here it says collection limiting, search in this collection. I may say, okay, I want to create a collection based on the membership of other collections. So I want to look for sccm nugget, but only the sccm nugget that may be already a member of some other collection that I've created previously. Now as you create your first collections, you'll find you don't have that many to start with, but as you begin creating and you have dozens or hundreds of collections out there, you'll want to begin focusing down and limiting that scopes because you just want to get just the correct machines that you're interested in. In my case, I'm not really interested in limiting the scope because I want to find sccm nugget wherever it's at in any collection whatsoever. I click the next button and you'll see that it's found sccm nugget, and that's the resource that I want to add into my collection. If I click Next, I'll begin and actually complete the direct membership rule wizard, and you'll see very immediately that the rule has been created for this collection. I have a type direct, I am not limiting the rule, and here's the rule that says sccm nugget. If I want to create additional systems, additional servers, I can do that as well. Maybe I want to do against all servers instead. What if I create a different rule here? I click Next again and I look for system resource equal to computer name here. Go scroll down to name, and instead of just looking for sccm nugget, in fact, just show me all the computers in our network. Show me every computer. The wildcard character is a %sign, and so in this case, I'm saying just show me everything that may have a name anywhere inside of my environment, and don't limit the collection. Don't limit my search in any way. The result will be all the systems that are currently in my Configuration Manager infrastructure here. You'll see all of these available resources that I could potentially choose and add to my collection. And so you'll see that using these direct membership rules, I can get pretty granular in the level of resources and the type of resources I want to actually collect. Here under attribute name, we've been focusing on computer name, but maybe I'm not interested in computer name. Maybe instead of the computer name, I'm interested in MAC addresses or last logged on usernames. I want to collect on all those systems where I have been the last logged on username, or IPX addresses, or IPv6 prefixes. There are a lot of additional resources, a lot of different additional attributes that you can use with which to pull those machines out, to search for those machines and put them into a collection using this direct membership rule wizard. Now I'm going to cancel this out because I've got my one membership rule that I'm interested in here. I can choose to update this collection on a schedule if I want. As you'll see here, every day, effective 3/5/2008 at 11:48 p.m., every day this collection, once a day, is going to update its membership. And so that's to say that the membership will stay static, but once a day it's going to go and re-verify to see if there are any other servers out there that may relate to this collection and then add them in. I'll show you also we can right-click any collection once we get back to the screen and speed this process up if we're interested in speeding up the collection update if necessary. I can choose additional schedules as well. Maybe instead of doing it once a day, maybe I want to do it once an hour or once every 30 minutes or so. I can make that change to speed up the amount of time it takes for those collection memberships to be updated. But again, just like before, anytime I attempt to speed up this level of data granularity, what that's going to do is provide an impact, a performance impact onto my server. So I always have to be careful with how I schedule events inside of Configuration Manager. In the next screen, I can choose to advertise a program to it at this point. I'm not interested in doing that because we'll talk about that a little bit later. I can choose security. I can choose class security and instance security, something we'll also talk about later, but essentially this says which users have the rights and privileges to modify or change or even view this collection once it gets created. And then now it will begin the process of creating the collection. You'll see now that once the collection is created, I have this new collection down here in my computer management node under collections. Here's Configuration Manager servers. Now instead of having all the systems that I may want to push a package to, I only have this one system, sccm nugget. In our next nugget, we'll actually talk a little bit about how to create collections based off of parameters as opposed to just directly throwing systems in there. And the reason why you'd want to do that is because directly throwing systems into a collection means you're not actually following with the dynamics that are going on inside of your environment. You know, environments are fairly organic, and so you want to be able to change collections as the environment changes. And so I think you're going to like the next nugget in addition to this one as well. So what did we talk about in this one? We talked about the inventory process and how we modify the client agents and how we can take a look at that inventory on any of our systems using Resource Explorer. We talked about how we can configure and modify what types of inventory we may be pulling through the concepts of MIF and MOF files. And we talked about collections, not only the predefined ones, the ones that come natively out of the box, but also how to create direct membership or static collections inside of our environment. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.